So now we have a few questions for our panelists, and these are interesting questions, and I think will be interesting to. So the first one is for Amanda. It says, can you explain better why the manufacturers aren't required to pay the full cost of recycling? And this doesn't make sense. This person's really adamant here. Isn't the whole idea that they paid for the recycling?
Right, so the statute, yeah, it has that line in there, and again, this was agreed upon by collectors, recyclers, manufacturers when it was brought to legislation. Yeah, so it flat out says manufacturers are supposed to pay for recycling and transportation. And then, but why isn't that happening, right? Why do we see that?
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and so a lot of it comes down to that mutually agreed upon, so the recycler can still charge a collector if they're not, if it's not being fulfilled by the manufacturer. We did look into how to enforce that, and that answer on how to enforce it was we need to put stronger language in the statute in order to do that, and that's what we attempted to do last spring, but there wasn't peace in the valley, and so it didn't pass. So we're just aren't able to enforce that. Yeah. So that's kind of the answer. But
interesting.
But I'm hoping today that manufacturers will look at this, and whether they're here or not, and if they're not haven't already, just start talking with the recyclers about that. So.
Yeah. And I think as Jonathan was talking about, there's this gap, right? And you were talking about a gap. I guess we have to figure out how to get together a little closer and have this discussion a little more. So that leads actually to a question that's similar for Anna Maria. It says, can you elaborate on the recommendation for DFE? Now, are you familiar with that acronym there? DFE, it looks like it. And it says, what is California's thinking to incentivize OEMs to manufacture green products? Maybe someone could elaborate on what DFE might be.
Design
okay. Designed for, is it E?
Environment recycling.
Designed for environment? Does that sound good? Okay.
So, as I mentioned, the Electronic Waste Recycling Act and subsequently the Car Electronic Waste Recycling Program doesn't support reuse and refurbishment activities. It's basically a recycling program. So we felt that refurbishment activities should be supported, and we were thinking that we could provide a payment. So refurbishment could be seen as a different type of recycling activity. Also, I mentioned that we could support grants and loans for repair and refurbishment reuse activities, so that could be another venue to support reuse. And this basically stems from encouraging the waste management hierarchy and products, encouraging reuse, which comes before recycling, and refurbishing products that can be then resold on the market and have value to be resold on the market.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, to improve that piece of it over the recycling. Okay, great. So this one is for Jonathan. It says, how would TCL envision that states could empower OEMs? You're mentioning that aspect.
Can everybody hear me? Okay. So the way we go about that is, as you know, every state EPR program is different. You line them all up. There's some differences in every single one. From our perspective, if we were involved in the conversation, we could provide our own recommendations of what we can do individually within each state based on the subtle differences between each program to make it work. So in one state, for example, if there's a shortfall in collection, we speak about that and we figure out ways. They might say it's in these particular counties, and we'll say, oh, okay, so let's try to enhance the collection in these particular counties. Another state might say, that's not our issue at all, our issue is this over here. And we'll say, oh, okay. So if we're involved in the conversation, and since we're the primary funding mechanism for a lot of these, we feel that our participation in the discussion can facilitate the solutions. Without our participation, it's just a conversation amongst the different parties that really don't have the ability to get it done, that just end up blaming manufacturers and don't actually provide solutions. So the more and earlier you involve manufacturers in that, the easier it is to obtain the solutions and the faster you obtain the solutions.
Okay, so with that, and I think this might be fielded for Jeff, if the OEMs are get earlier into this discussion, how would that affect the recyclers? Would that affect the cost or the work that the recycler has to do, or should they be involved in that conversation?
Yeah, I think the answer is pretty simple, that when a state is looking at developing or changing or updating their law, that all pieces of the puzzle should be included in the conversation, right? So obviously the legislators have their goals, the folks that are writing the laws, along with the state EPA agencies. Does have a major impact on OEMs and how they relate to that. And we're in the middle. There's an important piece that processors need to be involved in the conversation, and there should be other stakeholders as well. There's municipalities, county governments, there's individual residents that might want to say as well. So I think it's important to have everyone at the room while we're crafting this and developing solutions.
Is this happening?
I think in part, in some areas, absolutely. For example, in Minnesota, there were a lot of stakeholder meetings, which is important. I know in other states as well, but just using Amanda's example, a lot of stakeholder meetings. I think the challenge, so there's some positives there, a lot of opinions on all sides. Many agree, some slightly disagree, some completely opposite. I think some of the challenges behind the scenes when the laws are getting written, there's other changes that are happening. So there's a lot of input, and then there's the law, and they don't always kind of equal what the conversation was.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
On the same lines that we would like to know for sure from the state perspective, and to include us when manufacturers are talking about ideas too, because there's sometimes how will we actually make this work and enforce it and so on. So we would ask, if manufacturers are coming up with ideas to include the states too at some point. So all of us would like that too, both sides.
Right, so that's good.
We're both would like each other included.
You all want to get involved in that discussion. So actually, this one is for you. Excuse me. Do programs funded by consumers, such as California's program and Canada's, which have the consumer involvement, says, would that work better than the present EPR program structured like Minnesota's right now? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I don't have, I thought, am I going to get asked what's the ideal solution here?
Right, because you got the different states, yeah.
I think, I don't know, a challenge with California, as you noted, was all the employees and all the costs to run it. So I don't know if that would go more away from the manufacturers wanting more of a say. So I don't know. I don't think we would go that direction. But having the consumers, like a fee, maybe an eco fee, potentially. I'm not against that for sure, because I think consumers, all of us should know that it actually costs to recycle these things at the end. I would just want to make sure that fee, that not only the consumers but the manufacturers all had a piece of the what it's going to cost to recycle in the end, that we're not losing sight of sort of product stewardship, so that it's a shared responsibility of all those involved.
Yeah.
So, but I wouldn't be against it.
Sounds kind of like a perfect world that Jonathan was kind of talking about. And Anna Maria, what is your thought on that? Do you think you would see more of an equal share with manufacturers be more involved? What do you think as far as the programs that exist? Would you see yourself moving more toward Minnesota?
As I presented, so our recommendation is to keep the existing consumer fee and payment program, but enhancing the existing program. So we believe there are tremendous advantages to do that. basically limit the potential disruption to existing collection and recycling infrastructure. So any transition for such a huge program as California's, from a state-run program to an EPR program, would need very detailed transition plan and implementation. You cannot just change that in a few months. So we believe best would be, at least in the near future, to expand existing program and add new devices, and also increase manufacturer responsibility. So if we are not transitioning to an EPR model, we would like to see some increased manufacturer responsibility through annual reporting, better outreach and education, working towards enhancing durability of products. So there are other ways to bring the manufacturer in and ensure they are also participating.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, bringing them more into the conversation or into the financial stream to enhance what you have. That's a nice point. So this one is actually for Amanda and Jonathan. It says, what's the advantage and disadvantage of a state program using a weight-beared recycling obligation versus some sort of shared obligation? And then it says, or some other mechanism used to determine a manufacturer's recycling obligation within a given state. Does that make sense?
I suppose the weight-based has the light weighting issue.
I'm not certain if it's asking
Not that.
Yeah, it's kind of, it looks like, yeah.
for the weight-based issue versus a convenience standard, or if it's asking what the problem is with the weight.
Using a weight recycling obligation, yeah, versus some other shared obligation. Maybe, yeah, the future that we don't know yet.
Right. I think we all know manufacturer goals are based on pounds, and we charge and recyclers charge per pound, and everything is based on the universe of, it's kind of like the dollar, it's per pound. So ultimately, I think we all know it's not the future. You know, a lot of this was based on CRTs when it comes to weight-based stuff. Manufacturers were provided goals. Now the weights of these products has dramatically changed. The time it takes to take apart and recycle a TV versus the time it takes to take apart and recycle an iPhone. Incredibly different weights, incredibly different sizes, different shipping. There are a whole host of concerns when it comes to how you do that. I think what this is really going to get at the heart of is the per pound goal is going to go away, and manufacturer goals based on per pounds is going to go away. How, what replaces that at the end of the day? It's going to take a lot of conversation, but ultimately, I think that none of this even really matters at the end of the day unless consumers have an understanding, and I just wanted to make sure I get this in, that consumers have an understanding that they need to recycle their electronics, right? At the end of the day, when it comes to plastics and bottles and newspapers, consumers are still getting that wrong. They're putting, their old garden hoses and diapers in there, and they're recycling what they want to recycle, what they think should be recycled, and not what is recyclable. Well, if they can't get that right, how are they going to get electronics right? So when we talk about all this stuff, a lot of this really just goes back to education. When we talk about the fees and the per pound thing and the manufacturer responsibility, how much of this is going to come back to consumers being made aware of the fact that they should recycle, that they can, and how to do it? It's not going to be something that's at their curb, so they're going to have to have some sort of understanding of that. I go back to manufacturer participation in this conversation. Manufacturers are good marketers. We're good at consumer awareness. Around the corner from now is National Recycling, or America Recycles Day, I think it is in November. And one of our primary goals we're going to be doing as a company is trying to make consumers more aware of the fact that electronics recycling is important. We're good at that. Maybe get us more involved in that education part of it, and then some of that money that is maybe being used by other resources or other agencies and other organizations that is being paid toward that can be more effective if we do it, and then that money can go back to recyclers and other parts of this process.
You want to have some input on it? Is that covered?
That might cover it, except I do think about education. I'm like, oh boy, if we had even more come in, then the gap's even bigger. Of course, I agree with that. Like, holy moly, Minnesotans are doing pretty good without us. But I understand what you're saying too. But then, as we talked about earlier, the education of what it actually costs. That there's a cost to recycle. I think that's a piece too.
I completely agree. Consumers, they're buying products. They're not, in California, I think they have an awareness more than others because they see it on the receipt. They see that fee. What's that fee for? In a lot of different situations where you recycle the oil in your oil change or your tires or your mattress or the paint, they see it. But in most states, they don't see it like they do in California. There's not a general awareness of it. How that is going to be done is just a whole other conversation that needs to be had.
Interesting. So this is an interesting question for Jeff. Now, it's a preference now as far as the process of, would you rather work in a state where OEMs have more control over the program or less? And why?
And why? Nice. Okay. Right. So, to be honest, if you are doing what you're supposed to be doing, you do what you say you're going to do, you have good relationships with the regulators, you have an understanding of the law, and you have good relationships with the OEMs, it doesn't really matter if the OEMs have more control or less. It shouldn't matter because the value proposition, the cost to the OEM, the cost to the collector, the value from the commodities has to hit a number. And whether the OEMs are heavily involved or not heavily involved, if we're not at that number, we're not working in that state. So it's about having good relationships, and it's about understanding the positives and the puts and the takes to run a processing business.
Gotcha. Okay. Great. It's interesting points. So, Anna Maria, we have one for you. This is interesting about ECS. It says, what impacts on the state program has been caused by the bankruptcy and closure of ECS? Because they're a huge, tier 1. Son.
So as probably most of you heard, ECS shut down operations end of June. So regarding processing capacity, I think in California, so ECS was the largest recycler in our payment program. So I believe from a processing capacity perspective, we have other recyclers that can absorb the volume that went to ECS. So collectors are now switching towards other recyclers. So I think that's not an issue. My concern is more with collection activities in rural areas, especially Northern California. So ECS was covering very well those areas that are harder to reach for other recyclers and imply higher transportation costs.
I see. You mean like Modesto, those areas?
No, further north,
Even
Humboldt,
further?
towards Oregon, yeah, the northern part of California.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay. Very good. Yes, please.
If I could add one thing about that also, I think we all know that ECS had been around for a really long time, and I think its bankruptcy was probably it was a company that very few people expected that to happen. I think what it's taught a lot of us is, even more so in this industry, that we need to keep an eye out for the people we work with and the companies we work with. Perhaps it lends itself more to a process that can be implemented over time for how we do the due diligence on the companies that are in the industry, because the industry itself lends itself to these types of issues, and ECS was just a big surprise. So if it happened to ECS, it could happen to anyone, and we all care about what happens to our products downstream. So I just think it's important that we all recognize if it can happen to ECS, it can happen to anybody.
Yes, I know, because I remember we had that little discussion. In that discussion we had with the ECS process, as far as evaluation, how should we maybe evaluate? Maybe you might want to elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, there's a certain amount of due diligence that a manufacturer has to do when it works with a recycler or a collector. In a small number of state programs, we don't have that ability. We can't do that due diligence. We can't decide who we work with. But in the vast majority, we can. And when we can, it raises the issue, what's on the checklist? What do you go through to look for when you are dealing with a recycler? Apparently now, financials are a big part of what you look for. And how do you get access to that? And what are you really looking at? And how do you know that the documents that you're getting that they want to give you are going to tell you anything? So the due diligence now that you need to do to make sure that you're dealing with a company that you really truly want to work with has just become that much more complicated in an industry that's already, I think, pretty complicated.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and do your due diligence for sure. So, Amanda, we have a question. This one's a little long. I'll try to cut it down though. It says, if I understand, it says, as written, your law states manufacturers must pay for transportation and recycling. It says, however, your graph indicates many areas residents and their government pay 100%. It says, in addition, residents pay a purchase since the cost is currently built in, and they pay for transportation to deliver the recycling to the recycling centers. It says now there is discussion of another of eco-free type of, or eco-fee type of information. It says, how will you explain this transfer of cost from manufacturers to the citizens to your residents?
Oh my gosh, I don't know if I
That's
can almost read
a
that.
whole
So we don't, I might have not getting that correctly, but consumers don't have when they purchase, there isn't a fee right now.
So you don't give them a fee, okay.
But that might not be the question. Shoot.
Yeah, this is how to explain, I guess, the transfer of cost from the manufacturers.
That we don't
Purchase
see
cost.
happening. Does anyone else understand the question?
I think the question, we're done? Okay, we're not done.
Sound, yeah.
I think the question is related to
That's what I said.
the statement in the law that allows charges, right? So there was a lot of confusion, and maybe just give me 2 seconds to answer if you can. There was a lot of discussion when the law came out, what that 5 words meant, unless already agreed to, right? So if there was an existing contract where a municipality was paying some or all of the fees, that didn't need to change. So yes, the law, I think the intent of the law was to pass all costs on to the manufacturers. Whoever wrote that 4 words changed everything. And I remember sitting in stakeholder meetings, sitting with Jason Schatz back there from Dynamic. We sat and we literally said, nothing will change. The rates to the OEMs will remain the same, they have. The rates to the municipalities and the other collectors will remain the same, they have. The transportation will be sometimes subsidized by the folks that are doing the collecting, and it still is.
Yeah. So that language, when you look back, you're like, okay, who put this on there? And there's a little varying stories. But it was, basically the collectors thought, oh, and they've seen this in other states, I think Illinois, where, okay, a recycler gets the pounds they need for the manufacturers they're working with, and all of a sudden they're going to say, all right, we're done. And then these collectors who have, a truckload or more a day, well, we need this to go to somebody. What if we get cut off? So they thought, we want to have that language there to ensure that a recycler could keep working with a collector and start charging after obligated pounds were met. So that was initially in there for that part, and then that has hurt things. So
still under legislation, right?
yeah.
So we thank you so much. Let's have a hand for this.